Hello and welcome to AOPA Air Safety Institute's safety webinar, Situational Awareness, a Human Factors Perspective. We have lots of people still coming in. We're up almost to 600 right now, so thank you all for joining us. We'll continue to get them in there as we go through this introduction. My name is John Collins, and I am the Manager of Aviation Safety Programs for the AOPA Air Safety Institute and your host for this webinar. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Please make sure you've muted your microphones. If you have any technical issues, we will not be able to troubleshoot them during the webinar. Logging out and logging back in will usually solve any audio issues. We will take questions throughout this webinar and answer as many as we can before the end of it. Use the question mark on your PC or laptop control panel located on the right side of your screen, or the question mark at the top of the screen on your tablet or smartphone to submit those. Penny's and my webcam will be available here at the beginning of the webinar and also during the Q&A session at the end. For those of you that are on computers, we should appear to the left of your screens, and if you're on a tablet, we'll be at the top of the presentation. If you're viewing this on a smartphone, you may need to swipe left or right to view the webcams. Wings credit is available for the webinar, and if you signed up for this webinar with your FAA Wings account email, you will receive credit automatically to your Wings account within 7 days. A recording of this webinar will be available via the Air Safety Institute webpage, www.airsafetyinstitute.org, and you will receive an email with a direct link to it as well. If you've missed any of our previous webinars, you can find them at webinars.aopa.org. And for those of you that are using the AOPA Pilot Passport, a part of the AOPA app, attendance at this webinar will earn you an ASI webinar badge and 1,000 points. And I'll have more on that at the end of the webinar. Tonight's presenter is no stranger to ASI webinars. Dr. Penny Levin is a practicing clinical psychologist, a professor of psychology at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a flight instructor, the Wing Assistant Director of Safety for the Pennsylvania Wing of Civil Air Patrol, and an Air Safety Institute Flight Instructor Refresher Course presenter. Dr. Penny, you have the controls.
Thank you so much, John, for all of your hard work to make these webinars possible. And thank you to the Air Safety Institute. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and a special thanks to those of you who were here for my previous webinars. You came back for more. I hope everyone is healthy and safe as we continue our virtual seminars. As John said, I'm a clinical psychologist by trade, and I know from my work that a lot of people are having a really difficult time still right now. And anything that we can do to help make times better is what we'll do. As John said, I'm also a CFI and I'm a presenter for the Air Safety Institute. So I try to keep both hats on and talk about the psychological side of aviation while remembering that this all has to make sense for us pilots. So now that you know I'm a real person, I'm going to turn off my camera so you can concentrate on the webinar. So some of what I'm going to do tonight is talk about things that some of it you may already know about situational awareness, but I'm hoping to present it in a clearer and a more comprehensive way. I'm also going to give you a model for how to think about situational awareness. It's a bit more technical than my usual style, but I hope it'll be helpful for you as a way to evaluate your own situational awareness when you're flying. Finally, we're going to talk about maintaining situational awareness, cues we might have lost it, and getting it back before it's too late and we have an incident or an accident or an airspace bust. Before we start, I want to talk about an ASI case study that some of you may already be familiar with, but remains a very important accident to consider through the webinar tonight. So the video discussing this accident and a detailed analysis of the factors that led to it are available on the ASI website, and I'd encourage anyone who hasn't seen it to look at it. On November 22nd, 2011, a Rockwell 690 Aero Commander crashed into the Superstition Mountains of Arizona on a night VFR flight in clear conditions, shortly after departing from Falcon Field en route to Safford Regional Airport. All 6 people on board the aircraft, 3 adults and 3 children, were killed in this controlled flight into terrain accident. This was a CFIT accident. According to the NTSB, the pilot's complacency and poor situational awareness caused the accident. The aircraft was newly purchased and had been flown to Safford on a ferry permit since it had not had a required inspection. It did not have a terrain awareness and warning system, although that was required by regulation. It did have a GPS with a basic moving map and direct-to functionality, but it didn't depict terrain on that. However, the pilot was known to regularly fly with an iPad and software that gave him terrain awareness. It is not known whether he was using his iPad that night. The accident pilot had made the same flight 2 days previously in similar weather conditions in a different Aero Commander. GPS direct Safford to Mesa and return at night in clear weather, an almost identical flight profile to the accident flight. Again, both were set up to be flown GPS direct. On this flight, though, the tower controller asked the pilot to extend his upwind leg for traffic, and the tower would call his crosswind leg due to arriving aircraft. He was cleared for the right turnout almost 2 minutes after departing. 1 minute 30 seconds later, the pilot leveled off on a direct course to Safford at 4,500 feet in order to remain below the 5,000-foot floor of the Phoenix Class Bravo, as most pilots flying VFR did to clear until they were clear of Phoenix airspace. 2.5 minutes later, the aircraft impacted the face of the Flatiron region of the Superstition Mountains, which rise abruptly from the surface to an elevation of about 4,800 feet at the point of impact. So tonight, we're going to talk about each of the areas that you see on this slide in some detail. But first, as we saw in this case example, even highly experienced pilots can have lapses in situational awareness. There's a lot to think about with this accident, but for tonight, we're only going to talk about it in terms of situational awareness. Keep it in mind as we get into some of the ways to think about situational awareness tonight. Remember, this was an experienced pilot on a flight he was familiar with. There was a seemingly minor request to extend upwind, and because he did not think about the implications of that request, he lost situational awareness, and 6 people died. This is part of the reason that pre-flight planning is so important for all of us, even on seemingly routine flights. Good planning leaves us with more ability to stay aware of our surroundings and stay vigilant. We're not playing catch up by trying to plan in the air what we might have thought about on the ground. So as we saw in the accident, we tend to see what we expect to see. This may or may not be the same as what's actually happening. Just take a quick second to see that famous picture to the right side of the screen. As we'll see later, situational awareness overall improves the more flight hours we have. But as this example shows us, we really have to stay constantly vigilant. Overall, keeping track of location and environment are easier now that we have ForeFlight and glass cockpits. And we talked in our last webinar that the advantages of having the technology assumes that we have everything programmed properly and know where to find what we need. So airspace is obviously less of an issue for local flights and flights that we're familiar with, and it's more of a problem for unfamiliar and longer flights. But again, we can still run into trouble if we're not careful. It is really important to know what classes of airspace we'll be flying through and the rules for each of them. Will there be special use airspace that we're going to be finding on our route? Are there TFRs? Did you include this in your pre-flight plan and check on restrictions before the flight? In case you have a problem, can you document that you did check? Something I realized recently is that TFR patterns are obviously going to be different now that we have a new president, who doesn't go to the same places as our last president did. We also have to remember there are all kinds of airspace that we can go through besides just Class Bravo or Class Charlie, and be familiar with the rules for each of them. And it's important to know where to find the information for those rules. In terms of terrain and obstacles, I think the only thing that's really important to remember with this is that something that can look very tiny on a chart, an obstacle, can actually be quite large from the air. In terms of our altitude and our heading, what is it? What should it be? If you're VFR, are we on a correct altitude for the direction of our flight? With IFR, we need to be careful of undershooting, overshooting, and wandering. With weather, it's important to both know what the weather is at the moment, but also as we approach our destination. How old is our weather information? Are we getting complacent or taking risks if we have onboard weather? Traffic. We always need our heads outside. Always. Traffic is outside. Even if we see it on a screen, the plane that's going to hit us is outside of the airplane. The aircraft. So I actually love this picture. Apparently, assuming this is accurate, this couple launched with a cat on the wing and didn't notice it until they were in the air. As I said at the beginning, it's easy to see what we expect to see instead of what's actually in front of us. So on pre-flight, it may seem repetitive to go over questions, but we can get complacent. But always remember on pre-flight, am I familiar with this aircraft? Am I current? Do I know the memory items for emergencies in this plane? Do I know the best glide speed? In terms of performance, do I know what the actual performance in this aircraft is? Remember, the POH was written based on a new plane and it was flown by a test pilot. So if you're not flying a brand new plane and you're not a test pilot, it's often useful to add about a third to our calculations. Consider whether our aircraft is equipped for the flight we're planning. Are the lights working in case we run late? Make sure we can take off and land at our destination and our alternates with an adequate margin of safety under the conditions that we have. This is going to be more of an issue in the summer when density altitude can limit performance. Am I loading the plane properly and doing a proper weight and balance, or do I just assume it's fine because it always is? In flight, am I monitoring my engine instruments in a systematic way? Do I have to keep track of tank changes? If the winds change or ATC reroutes me, will I still have enough fuel? Are the crosswinds going to be outside of the limits for this aircraft? All right, so the profile. These are kind of the basic questions that we think about with situational awareness. Where have we been? Where are we now? Where are we going? How are we going to get there? It's always a question, can I still complete my flight as planned? And are there any changes that might keep that from happening? Are we encountering winds aloft that we're not comfortable flying with or that may change our ETA? Is there weather or IFR en route? If there is the plane certified for IFR, and am I IFR current? I used to own a wonderful little Diamond that was not IFR certified. I was, but the aircraft wasn't. It's important to always know if anything has changed in terms of our destination weather. Are there winds that I'm not comfortable with or are outside of the maximum demonstrated crosswind component for this plane? Are there visibility or ceilings now at my destination that I'm not comfortable with, even if they're legal? And how am I going to know and be sure if any of those things are the case? I recently watched a piece on John Kennedy Jr. and looked at the chances that he had to change his mind before launching. He was running late, he was post-surgery, he was pretty new to Saratoga, he was using weather that was not current when he took off, and he even turned down having a CFI ride along. It's really important that we think about these questions both before we launch and en route. All right, so now we have the tasks at hand. Again, what do I need to do now? What do I need to think about doing in 15 minutes? What do I need to think about doing in 30 minutes? The more we can plan and anticipate, the more we can manage any unexpected circumstances. Anybody ever skipped a cruise checklist? A descent checklist? Is there an approach coming that I need to brief if I'm flying IFR? Do I know what my missed procedures are? Have I briefed my destination airport? Do I have the ATIS? Do I know where to get the frequencies for that? Is the radio set correctly? Is the GPS set correctly? Is there anybody I need to be talking to? The basic question is does what I am seeing right now make sense? So this is the human factor side, and we see the PAVE and I'm safe checklists, and just know that occasionally we see different things, like the E could stand for eating, it could be emotion. Essentially what we want to think about are human factors here. In a certain sense, situational awareness really is all about human factors. We need to take care of ourselves so that we can be at our best when we fly. And that's how we keep ourselves and our customers safe, or our passengers. So, what stressors are you bringing with you to the airport? And there are more of them for a lot of people right now. And we talked about some of that in the webinar on stress. There are financial stressors, marital stressors, family, work, school. Is there a way to leave that stuff at home? If not, are you willing to not fly? Then there are flight-related stressors. These can be actual issues like lower ceilings than you expected or some issue with the plane, or they can be your own personal insecurities about flying, which may or may not be the same as your actual weaknesses. Often the things that we think we have trouble with when we fly aren't the same as the ones that really cause trouble for us. Please do not neglect food and hydration. We're not going to talk about those much tonight, and we did touch on them briefly in a previous webinar. We will talk later about workload management, but just consider what you think are the highest workload phases of flight. If we can anticipate the workload associated with the next phase of our flight, we can get ahead of it. Generally, the workload increases when we're transitioning. That includes takeoff and climb, and descent and approach and landing, most often. Okay, so once again, these are the questions that help us to develop a plan to continuously monitor our flight, interpret what we see, and figure out if there's anything we need to do to deal with it. I'll warn you, the next slide is a little bit technical from a human factor standpoint, but bear with me. So this really shows us how good situational awareness leads to good aeronautical decision making. There are 3 stages in this model of situational awareness. There's perception, comprehension, and projection. In English, it means we see something, We figure out what it means for this flight, and we guess what might happen next. So first we need to perceive or notice what's happening around us. That really is kind of what the issue was on the case that we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. Next, second is comprehension. We need to understand what we're looking at and compare it to our experience or our mental models that we have about flying. We compare what we're seeing now to what we've come to expect in this plane under these circumstances. And third is projection. Given what I'm seeing and my understanding of it, what is likely to occur next, and is that outcome safe? So for example, I'm on final in a 172, I'm 300 AGL, okay? I notice my airspeed is a little below 50 knots, and I'm seeing 3 red lights on the PAPI. I'm at full flaps, not quite lined up right on the runway. Okay, that's what I'm seeing. I compare the information to my mental model of a stabilized approach. That model tells me that in VFR, I generally want to be stabilized no later than 500 feet AGL, and that's going to include my glide path, my heading, my airspeed being configured for landing, my rate of descent, my power setting, having done the checklist. So given what I'm seeing about this approach, I think I'm low and slow, and I now project that this is not a safe landing. So I decide, go around. So we recognized what the plane was doing, compared it to our mental model to determine if it was safe, and then decided that the likely outcome was not good. You come up with a plan of action, and then you execute it. And this is a process that lets us consider our options before we have an emergency. So we all have mental models about different aspects of flying. As we get more experienced as pilots, our models get more sophisticated, and they include all the different kinds of situations that we've been in on different kinds of flights. When we're students just learning to land the plane, the CFI tells us what altitude, what power setting to fly for downwind and base and final, and where to look and when to put in the flaps and how to know when to flare. So as a newer student, we have a fairly primitive mental model about landing. Because of that, student pilots are only allowed to fly with an instructor on board and in good weather until they solo, and then still with constraints. Once we get some experience, we start to be able to think about things like stabilized approaches and wind corrections and communication and more of awareness of our other traffic in the pattern. When we move into instrument work, our mental model, gets even more sophisticated, and we can handle more complicated approaches under more difficult conditions and still maintain our situational awareness. That is because what we are looking at, we know more about what we're looking at, that perception, and how to interpret it. That's the comprehension. So the individual factors that impact our situational awareness include our knowledge and our training and our experience and our ability. And that's one reason that experienced pilots overall have better situational awareness than student pilots. Embry-Riddle actually did a study. I looked for studies, as I always do, and I didn't have a lot of luck finding situational awareness in aviation, general aviation particularly. I did find a fair amount of work on driving, but Embry-Riddle did have a study, and in that they looked at student pilots, commercial students with 100 to 200 hours, and people working on ATP who had more than 200 hours. They had the CFIs rate the situational awareness, and they did find across any number of different parts of the flight that it was true that the more experience the pilot had, the better their situational awareness. They also found that the least experienced pilots had the most trouble with situational awareness on taxi, takeoff, climb, descent, and landing. Again, those are the higher workload phases of the flight. So if anyone actually has information on a study on situational awareness in aviation other than this one, please put it in the chat. I would love to see it, okay? Again, I found a lot of stuff on driving, but less for aviation. So the last slide showed the individual factors that affect our situational awareness, but there are also aspects of the flight itself. Those are the task and environmental factors that we looked at earlier in the presentation, and we'll talk about this more in a bit. For now, just know, the more complex the aircraft or the technology, the higher the workload at any time during the flight, and the more stressors we're dealing with, be they personal or flight related, the more difficult it's going to be to maintain situational awareness. That same Embry-Riddle study showed that the areas that were most sensitive to experience were the basic procedures like completing checklists, proper crosswind technique for takeoff and landing and radio communications, the task management, managing these high workload portions of the flight, handling distractions, and avoiding fixation. They found that vigilance improved with experience, which is maintaining an awareness of traffic and terrain and airspace. They found that awareness of weather improved with experience, both surface winds, winds aloft, thunderstorms, icing, and also a sense of how on a longer flight weather can change. And they found that dealing with malfunctions improved with experience, being able to diagnose the problem and understand emergencies. So graphically, this is kind of what a less experienced versus more experienced pilot, why situational awareness is different in those two groups. The section where the three intersect is what we think of as the person's ability to remain situationally aware. And as students, we were less able to see when things didn't seem right. We had fewer mental models about aviation to compare those perceptions to, and therefore we were less able to see how our current situation might develop during the flight. As we get more experienced, we're able to notice, perceive that things aren't right more easily because we have mental models for more aspects of flying. We know how to be aware of terrain and obstacles and airspace restrictions and understand the weather that we collect. And obviously, we understand how the aircraft behaves under different circumstances. We have more familiarity with routes and airspace and ATC procedures. So the more we understand that, the more situationally aware we are, and the better able we are to play out scenarios of what could happen next. Then we act according to those ideas and see if what we did helped the situation. So later on tonight, we're going to talk about some ways to maintain situational awareness while we get that experience. So I think it's always important to show the FAA's position on anything that I'm presenting. So the FAA lets us know that situational awareness encompasses all 5 elements of risk, including the flight, the pilot, the aircraft, the environment, and the operation. So overall, we're situationally aware when we maintain a good overall picture of what's going on during the flight. And these are the questions that they suggest will demonstrate for ourselves that we are remaining situationally aware, and that losing awareness of any of these factors can result in an overall loss of situational awareness. So let's get down to some specifics now, okay? In terms of situational awareness, not all flights are the same. So we're going to talk about a lot of distinctions that impact maintaining our situational awareness on a flight. So routine versus novel. This is a bit of a double-edged sword. We tend to plan better for novel flights than routine flights, but they usually have more variables to consider. And again, from the case study we listened to, we can lose situational awareness at any time, even on a flight that we just completed, when we had just completed a similar one. So simple versus complex flights. Simple flights present less of a challenge, but it's much easier when we are on something that is simple and routine than it's easier to become complacent when we're on a simple or a routine flight than on a more complicated flight. Conventional versus glass. So we talked about last time, glass presents challenges and requires better workload management and better awareness of distractions and fixation. But it obviously gives us very much in return in terms of the information that we have available. So a local versus a cross country, which of these are we taking? We're going to have better mental models for our more familiar airports and routes, but again, we also tend to plan better when we leave our home turf. VFR versus IFR. Obviously, VFR flights present less of a weather challenge, and we have the benefit of both visibility and our instruments, but IFR pilots tend to be well trained and have broader experience in more types of weather and have the benefit of ATC contact throughout. So recreational versus necessary. The less necessary a flight is, the less likely we are to have get-there-itis. And certainly it's easier to walk away. With Civil Air Patrol, it's obviously harder to walk away from a mission because there's a critical variable, lives can depend on it. It is always easier to walk away from a recreational flight, but the JFK Jr. example is a bit of a cautionary tale even on that. So is the flight instructional or non-instructional? That is a fairly complicated topic, and it's something we talk about at the flight instructor refresher courses. The difficulty with instructional flights, the advantage obviously is we have a CFI on board. The difficulty occasionally is that there's a tendency to have two heads down, and that happens particularly with instrument training, and it can also happen with flight reviews. Flight reviews can present a particular situational awareness problem because both pilots tend to be slightly less vigilant because there's another pilot on board. The CFI knows that he or she is flying with another pilot, often in his or her own aircraft, and the pilot could be less vigilant because there's a CFI on board. So day versus night obviously makes a difference with situational awareness. In the daytime, we have visibility, we don't have visual illusions on landing, and we are less likely to be tired and hungry. And from my own experience, if you're not flying a glass cockpit, personally, I have found in some of the planes I have flown, the instruments have been fairly difficult to see at night when you most need them. So is this the first flight of the day, or are we having multiple flights? We're fresher earlier in the day, and when we fly multiple flights or legs in a day, we could be tired or hungry or anxious to get to our destination or to get home, and it's easy to be then less vigilant. So not every flight is the same. Not all pilots are the same. So way back, I believe I may have even been a student pilot. I went to a safety seminar, and it was about aging. And I commented as a psychologist, which I occasionally would open my mouth and do, that, well, actually, visual motor skills do decrease with age. And my goodness, I got an earful about that. So the reality is, and I say this as someone who is absolutely chronologically challenged, our visual motor skills are slower, but experience also matters in terms of our understanding and our our mental models, and often our ability to stop and assess a situation. So it's very much a double-edged sword. So newer versus more experienced pilots in terms of all pilots not being the same. We talked about the benefits of having more complete mental models as we get more experienced, but we also tend to become more complacent as we get more experience. This is another lesson possibly that we could have learned from the accident that we reviewed at the beginning of the webinar. Both situational awareness and complacency were considered important in that accident. So rusty versus current versus proficient, that includes the aircraft and the technology. Stick and rudder skills can be really different in different planes. When I was doing my CFI training, I had my Diamond, which was basically kind of like a glider with an engine. And I also was working on an Arrow to do all of my retractable work. So the Diamond, really, the sense was you could glide forever. I think it had an 11-to-1 glide ratio. And in comparison to that, when I would get into the Arrow, it literally felt to me like a sack of potatoes or a refrigerator once I cut the power and put in the flaps. So it's important, just because we have flown recently, to be clear in terms of stick and rudder. Have we flown a similar aircraft? So last time we talked about the fact that technology now can be very different from aircraft to aircraft, so not all 172s are the same anymore. So if you've flown the Garmin lately, that doesn't really help you the next time you get into an Avidyne. It's important when we think about current and proficient to think about both the aircraft and about the technology in terms of being able to maintain our awareness of all the factors in that airplane. And legally and technically current does not mean we are proficient. And for many of us, this is even more of an issue with COVID and having less opportunity to fly. So are we complacent or are we vigilant? Obviously, vigilance is better. And again, while research shows that experienced pilots are more complacent, it does show that overall their situational awareness is better. Think about it though. Have you ever really met a complacent student pilot? So fatigued or rested is another pilot variable to think about with situational awareness. Highly fatigued individuals are 70% more likely to be involved in an incident resulting in an injury. People with disturbed sleep who report they have disturbed sleep are nearly twice as likely to die in a work-related accident. We now have duty days. And my daughter is a physician. She is finishing up actually her fellowship. And I treat physicians and residents as a psychologist. And it is mind-boggling to me when I hear about decisions that they have to make post-call when they haven't slept in 36 hours. So it's important to think about our fatigue. Are we stressed or calm? Here again, the more we can do to leave our home stressors home and plan as many of our flight-related stressors as we can, the better. Think about hydration, think about food. A word from the psychologist quickly. There are multiple stressors associated with COVID that likely are impacting our situational awareness. We don't have any data on accident and incident rates yet, but my best guess is that, like other areas, we will be seeing more pilot-related difficulties. Some of it is that, people may be either restricted or uncomfortable with flying with a CFI or a safety pilot, and therefore our currency and recency are likely to fall below. Pre-COVID, about 1 in 5 Americans reported symptoms that warranted a diagnosis of anxiety or depression. That number, and this was as of January, not even into the depths of winter here, was at 41% of people reporting symptoms that would warrant a diagnosis of an anxiety or depressive disorder. This got a lot of attention after the Germanwings incident several years ago when the suicidal pilot flew the Airbus A320 into a mountain, but hasn't received as much talk recently. We like to think that as pilots, we do not have any mental health problems, but I do not know of any reason that we are any different from the rest of the population. And the difficulty is that even mild anxiety and depression can show some of these difficulties that you see on the slide. Issues with sleep, appetite, concentration, focus. And all of those negatively impact our situational awareness and our ability to fly safely. Now, in another study that was done fairly recently, 2,500 adults in the US were surveyed, and 23% admitted to drinking more since this last year with COVID than before that. Okay, so we've also had 81,000 drug overdose deaths in the past 12 months. It's important to assess ourselves and look at these factors in maintaining our situational awareness. Okay, so what are the procedures that will help us maintain our situational awareness? As it turns out, they're often the same procedures that help us with safety in a number of different ways, not just situational awareness. But situational awareness depends on being able to quickly look at a number of different sources of information and still fly the plane and still maintain an overview of how it's progressing, the flight's progressing. Having good cockpit organizational habits like using all of our checklists helps us to develop those mental models for what we can expect on a flight, which again helps us notice when something is not right. So, oddly enough, having a clear set of procedures that you use in every single flight is the first step in maintaining your situational awareness, and maintaining situational awareness is the first step in good aeronautic decision making and the key to a safe flight. All right, so those are the procedural side. These are the personal issues. Know thyself, warts and all. Be brutally honest about your strengths and your weaknesses at this moment. Ask other people who know you're flying or have flown with you recently. Have a really good and thorough flight review instead of just having a buddy go through the motions with you. It is well worth the effort and sometimes the embarrassment of seeing the things that we need to work on. So rigorous pre-flight planning. I have a tennis pro who always said to me, the 5 Ps are really important, and I don't mean the ones we see in aviation typically, but proper planning prevents piss poor performance. Pre-flight planning is something that is an important personal habit to have. Pilots don't tend to mind briefing flights as much as debriefing them, but both briefs and debriefs help us. The brief helps us anticipate the problems we might encounter and think through what we would do about them. The debrief helps us think about what went wrong and what went well and what we can do to make our next flight better. That aids particularly with the perception part of situational awareness. We're going to maintain our situational awareness better about areas we have talked through. Again, stick and rudder skills. We all have room for improvement. It's one less thing to worry about. And work on the skills that you think you need work on. You know, think about what those are for you, the ones that really are difficult, more difficult for you. Consider inviting along a CFI or if you are rusty. So it's very easy to, especially if we're on autopilot, to not remain attentive and mindful during routine phases of flight. But those are really the times that we can check the airplane, make sure everything is as it should be, plan for the high workload areas, make sure we're not missing anything. As an aside, there's some recent work that's showing that mindfulness training improves situational awareness in driving. My best guess is that would work for us as well. It's really important in terms of being able to maintain situational awareness to continually reevaluate our personal minima for self, weather, aircraft, equipment. All of this helps us become complacent, and especially right now, if you happen to be not able to fly as much as you would like to, it is a way to know that you are proficient and able to take the flight that you would like to take. Oh, get there-itis, passenger pressure. These are going to be areas that can get all of us. Again, think about the John F. Kennedy Jr. Example. Also, just a word about mediocre performance and imprecise flying. To the extent that we can aim to actually hit the altitude we want to hit, be at exactly our aiming point, and accept that as the standard we're trying to get to, we will be better pilots. Okay, so here are some cues that we've lost it. This can happen at any point on a flight. It's most dangerous on takeoff and climb or descent and landing, obviously, to lose situational awareness because we have less time, altitude, and airspeed to see that something's wrong and figure out how to fix it. So some of the areas that create real problems with situational awareness are fixation, overload, and poor planning. We end up playing catch up, doing something in flight that we might have handled before we launched. It's easy to get distracted by passengers or something on one of our screens we're trying to figure out. And it's a clue that we've lost it is that we notice we are looking inside a lot. These are all potential clues that we have lost our situational awareness. So how do we get it back? First of all, know that we lost it. What happened? What's not right? Did I miss a checkpoint? Is the airport not where I expected it? Do those runways look like they're not configured how I expected them to be? So what do we do now? In a few minutes, we'll talk about some ways to slow down and give ourselves a chance to assess the situation that we're in. So we need to think about what don't we know. Once we know what the problem is, we can think about what we don't know, what we need to know, and that helps us plan a course of action. Again, as I said, major culprits: distraction, inattention, fixation, and fatigue. One of the ways to avoid inattention is to have clear procedures for keeping track of important aspects of the flight. If you're not sure with fixation, that's really focusing on one thing to the exclusion of everything else. I was on a flight once with a friend. We got caught up worrying about rudder trim on final. Something didn't seem right. What we failed to notice was the propeller slowing down. Okay? And fatigue we have talked about. But first things first, what is critical to the flight right now? Do I have enough fuel? Do I have an emergency landing spot? What is urgent right now? All right, so first, be right. The goal is to get the big picture back. Okay, the goal is to get the big picture back. We all know aviate, navigate, communicate. That's the order of things. Reduce the workload. Okay, if that means using the autopilot, that may be a way to buy time. If you are not on an instrument plan and you have another pilot or a knowledgeable passenger on board, you can find a spot and just circle. Practice that turnaround point while you think through what's wrong and what you need to do. We can reduce threats by getting away from the ground and any other obstacles, and that gives us more altitude and therefore more of a safety net. We need to establish a safe and stable flight profile and slow down. That way, we have more time to safely analyze the situation. If the problem has to do with altitude or heading, we fix it immediately. If we have to confess to someone, like we're on an instrument plan, do that when we have a minute. If we follow our SOPs, including our sterile cockpit and our checklists, those will help us identify the problem. As Gene Kranz said with Apollo 13, don't want to make it worse by guessing. All right, so getting it back, the big picture. Think about the situation with information from different sources in open mind. So it's important here not to give in to automation bias that we talked about last time. Just because a computer is telling me something doesn't mean it is necessarily accurate. Think about what other information can I be looking at now to confirm the situation. Cross-reference, what doesn't make sense here? For example, are the frequencies that I see on the screen the same as those on my flight plan or my iPad or kneeboard or approach plate? Cross-reference your information. Try to avoid fixating on a past problem or one aspect of this particular situation. Planes have crashed into mountains while the pilots were busy troubleshooting minor malfunctions. To the extent that you can minimize your distractions and your stressors at that moment, do so. So think about the data. What do you see versus what you expected to see, or your ideas about what you ought to be seeing? That huge cloud in front of you is probably more accurate information than the latest onboard weather information. If you're delayed, you're delayed. Worse things have happened. And if you have to ask for help, that's fine too. And worst case scenario, if you declare an emergency, you declare an emergency. So, summing it all up, these are the factors that impact situational awareness, and some of them we talked about tonight. Some of them we discussed in prior human factors webinars over the past year, and some of them possibly we'll be able to talk about in the future. So I want to thank everyone again for being here and come back into focus here. And John, do we have questions?
Do we have questions? Yes, we do. Thank you all for sending them in. I realize we're pushing up against our 8 o'clock time limit, so we probably will run over a little bit long. If you need to get away at 8 o'clock, you will get the link to the webinar, and you'll be able to get the webinar code at the end so you can get your pilot passport badge. But let's dive into some of these questions right now. a lot of good. I'm going to go back a little bit in the presentation, see if we can come up with. So this question came in. David wanted to ask you this. A couple of us have been discussing how to resolve disagreements between analog and digital systems, especially when you have them sitting right next to each other and one is saying one thing and one is saying another. For example, when a Garmin 1000 shows a different airspeed than the analog instrument right beside it. So assuming the pilot notices the differences, which one is he more likely to believe, or she? Is there a bias to believing the instrumentation that the pilot was trained on? That is, would a pilot who did primary training in a glass cockpit tend to believe the Garmin, while a pilot trained in an analog cockpit tend to believe the traditional airspeed indicator?
So I cannot say which pilot would believe which instrument in terms of their training. I can tell you that there is both automation bias and automation complacency. Automation bias suggests that we believe the more highly automated thing that we see, the piece of information, and automation complacency, the research on that has shown that often we will see some piece of information on a more automated platform, and even if we have clear evidence that it is inaccurate, we will tend to believe that and not act on it. So that's the information that I have on that question. That's a great question, though.
Yep. Yeah, it was. Yeah, it is. Francis asks, what happens if our mental models are outdated or incorrect? Does the state of the environment and the system ever influence the pilot and give a biased mental model?
Wow. Well, I have continuing education requirements in my field. I've been in my field for many, many years, and it is mind-boggling to me occasionally what I still could learn and what I could still keep up with. What's interesting to me is that, and I'm preaching to the choir here because I'm talking to people who have come to a safety seminar, we have very few requirements in aviation for keeping our material updated, which would prevent that kind of bias in terms of our mental models. For example, with flight instructors, at least we have to do the refresher course every 2 years. But if we believe that that's the case, if one of us believes that to be the case, then the thing to do is to start becoming more current and not to let those models stay outdated. And some of them, it doesn't matter. But with others, like airspace and aircraft requirements, ADS-B out, things like that, we have to update our information.
Kenneth asked the question, or do you have any comments on the need for pilots to learn to load shed tasks and concentrate on the highest priority job at hand, often called compartmentalization? I know you mentioned that as we were talking about some ways to try to maintain or retain or get back situational awareness, but do you have any specific recommendations that you want to make for that?
Task, I'm not familiar with that specific term. Task prioritization certainly is something that I thought about while I was putting this presentation together. I can't remember if I actually talked about it in specifics, but yes, I mean, we think about task prioritization in the larger sense. It's aviate, navigate, communicate. First, we talked a little about first things first. Am I at a safe altitude? Do I have enough fuel? Those kinds of things. Compartmentalization, my concern with that as a concept is we don't want to lose the big picture. We don't want to become fixated. And again, I'm not familiar with that exact formulation, but those would be my concerns.
Okay. All right. There's a question here from a student pilot.
Oh, welcome.
Yeah. And his question was, how can he, what does he need to do to learn better ADM and situational awareness, aeronautical decision making, situational awareness. He's in ground school right now. How can he improve? What are the things that he can do to get to that large model of awareness as opposed to the smaller SA model that you had?
Experience, learning, training, reading, coming to these seminars, talking to other pilots, hangar flying, armchair flying. All of these will contribute to developing more comprehensive mental models. And thank you to the student for being here tonight and for being interested in this topic.
And here's a comment back when you were talking about being chronologically challenged. Is there a maximum age limit to learn how to fly? And I understand ATC requires the maximum age to be 30 because of situational awareness. Does this apply to people who want to fly, but they're 40 or above?
Well, for whatever it's worth, when I was a little girl, I wanted to be an astronaut, but in my day, little girls did not do things like that. So I ended up as a psychologist. On my 40th birthday, the gift from my husband was my discovery flight. So if you would like to know if you can learn to fly after 40, I'd love to meet you. I think, as I often say to him, it was the most expensive gift anyone could have given me because I wound up with, you know, my private commercial instrument CFI and an aircraft.
Nice. Well, and I did have the opportunity to fly with a gentleman in his 90s. One of the guys that I went to church with, he was a pilot and he learned to fly back during World War II. Actually, I think a little before World War II, and was in the Civil Air Patrol then. But of course, life intervened as it always does, and so, you know, 40 or 50 years later, now he was back trying to get back into it, and I had the opportunity to fly with him, and he's a great pilot. And he was also, he knew that he wasn't going to fly on his own. He always had another pilot in the airplane with him. And he purchased an Evictor Sports Star and went the light sport route, and flew that for a number of years before he passed away. But he was a good example of, you know, it's never too late to learn. It's never too late to come back. And you can do that.
Yeah. May I just add a very quick thing
Sure.
to that? Research has shown that it is in fact true that cognitively we use it or lose it. So any new skills that we can learn as we age are important.
Okay. Yep, that's absolutely true. Here's a question from Francis. Currently, how is the industry helping pilots who are experiencing anxiety and other mental problems that would contribute as stressors that would affect their situational awareness?
Oh my goodness, by that I assume Francis means the aviation industry, which
Yes.
gets us into the entire issue of what we have to do to remain medically allowed to fly. And obviously that is often at odds with complete transparency regarding any mental health concerns we may have. Now on basic med, you really only have to report major psychiatric disorders like psychosis and bipolar, things like that. But I am not at the general aviation level, and please, if someone does have this information, I would love to see it. I am not aware of specific initiatives to help general aviation pilots in those areas.
Okay. All right. Speaking of studies, there have been a number of links sent in, so I'll send those to you, Penny, and if you want to let me know if I should include that in the links that go out with our email, we can certainly do that. Let's see, there was another good question here that I just saw.
There have actually been a lot of really nice questions, so
Yeah.
Thank you guys. You're paying attention.
Yes, here's what Fred asked this question. Normalization of deviance is an insidious problem, especially as pilots gain experience. Can you suggest ways to avoid this?
Yeah, that's the old, like, yeah, I do it that way because my flight instructor did it that way, and it's easy when we're not being watched to become careless and to accept less than perfect performance from ourselves. I mean, check enforcing the things we talked about tonight, enforcing for yourself, checklist usage. It's hard to call out other people on these things, but we can pick and choose who we get in an airplane with, to tell you the truth. I once got in the plane with a guy who bent the prop, and while we were in the pattern, it was clear that this was working on my CFI. It was clear what the problem was. He bounced the plane. It was a Mooney. He bent the prop. I asked afterwards, would you like to know what I saw? And he said, no, it was just the wind. I know how to fly this thing. And I thought, okay, there's not much I can do about that. But for those of us that are concerned, if we adhere to our SOPs, if we use our checklists, if we keep training and not accept what's a couple 100 feet here and there,
Mhm.
it will help shift the culture in a way that has the flying be generally safer with few of those problems.
Um, Last question, and then we'll go into how you can get the webinar badge and the closing. Nino asks, are there any tools that pilot can take advantage of to maintain mental health, especially in this time of the pandemic? And there's kind of a supplementary question to that Itamar, I'm sorry, not Itamar, but James asked. How would you recommend a pilot deal with depression and anxiety during these times? Couldn't reporting these issues lead to penalties on their licenses and medical? So kind of a double question there, a
Yeah,
two-part question.
right.
Uh,
Yes. And the answer is yes, there are disincentives for reporting our mental health problems and seeking treatment. I cannot tell you how many pilot friends and colleagues over the years have asked me, can't you just talk to me, my husband, my wife, whoever, because then it somehow would be not reportable. Um, and I think that is a really serious problem in our field, particularly in this country. After the Germanwings incident, Europe and other places, as well as the US, had joint task forces to address mental health at the level of airlines, but hopefully would filter down. And essentially, the position the US landed on was to encourage encourage a more friendly environment for reporting and seeking mental health care. I mean, this is an area obviously that is near and dear to my heart. If there's interest in this, even potentially as a webinar, let us know. And I would love to do a deep dive and talk about it.
okay. Well, we'll take that as an IOU for a future topic. Dr. Petty, as always, thank you for joining us and sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you to all of you. I think at one point we had over 840
Whoa.
folks on the webinar with us tonight. That was a really great turnout. Thank you. If you had to leave early and you're picking this up on the web, great. I'm going to get into that very important question. How do you get credit for this? So you'll automatically get Wings credit if you signed up using the same email that you used to set up your Wings account at FAAsafety.gov. But if you are also using the AOPA app, there is the AOPA Pilot Passport that's a part of that app. And that is something that we've been giving out badges for attending our webinars. So to claim your February ASI webinar badge and the 1,000 points, you're going to go to the app and go to the Redeem Affiliate Code section. I'll share that with you here in a moment. This is the code you need to enter, ASI WEB, Web 021821. Again, that's ASI Web 021821. That's today's date. This code is valid until March 17th, and that is actually the day before our next ASI safety webinar. And let me give you a quick plug for that. So on the 18th of March at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, CFII and meteorologist JP Dice is going to talk about avoiding the dangers of convective weather. I know most of us are in the midst of some winter weather right now. Kind of hard to think about thunderstorms and convective weather, but It's coming. It's a cycle. So you'll receive an email from us with a link to the recording of the webinar and a link to register for the March 18th webinar. To get to the pilot passport badge, to redeem it, you want to go to the app on your device, and then in the upper left-hand corner, you see a menu. I've circled that in yellow. Just go ahead and tap on that. Then tap on Pilot Passport. And then that'll open up a menu. Tap on My Pilot Passport. And then on My Points and Badges, which is all the way down at the bottom of that page, just scroll down to the Redeem Affiliate Code. Tap again. And then you can enter the webinar code in the affiliate code space. And again, that code is going to be good for the next month. And it is ASI Web 021821. So go ahead and grab that. You'll get 1,000 points. You'll get a cool badge to add to your rack of badges on your app. And thank you for watching. ASI Safety Education is funded, by pilots and enthusiasts like you. It comes to us through the AOPA Foundation. So if you're interested in contributing to our production of this safety material, please go to aopafoundation.org and click on the link to donate. And also, if you're not an AOPA member and you'd like to become one, go to this link, aopa.org/join today, and become a member and join our pilot community. We have over 300,000 of us around the country, owners and pilots. Large GA organization, I believe still the world's largest general aviation organization. And that's something to smile about. And I'm hoping we're going to be getting out this year and we're going to be seeing you folks in person. And that is something I'm looking forward to. So on behalf of Dr. Penny, myself, the folks here at ASI and AOPA, thanks for watching and fly safe.